everybody, and most welcome to our keynote speak by Dr. Rudolph Matthee, which is chaired by Professor Bianca Devos, a colleague from CNMS, Center on Immediate Studies. My name is Mohammad Reza Farzanegan, and I'm also from University of Marburg, and I'm very happy on behalf of IIEA that we could win these two esteemed colleagues to join us for this today event, which is our last event before the summer break. And I'm very happy which we have this topic and this presentation today on a very interesting and important topic, which is related to the historical roots of self-sufficiency in Iran. The presenter is going to be introduced by my colleague, Bianca, who is the head of Iranian Studies Department at the University of Marburg. And just a quick note here that during the presentation, please feel free to send your comments and questions in Q&A box here in the Zoom. You see that which is available for receiving your comments. And after around the 40 to 45 minutes presentation of our keynote speaker, we have the opportunity to discuss your comments and questions, and there would be a good amount of time to deal with the questions and the comments. So for around 40 minutes after presentation. So I don't take much time now. I will give the floor to my colleague, Bianca, who kindly accepted to moderate and chair this panel, to introduce our panelist, the keynote speaker today, and I'm very delighted to join this panel as well. Thank you very much. Bianca, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammad. And thanks to IIEA for the invitation to chair this webinar. I'm delighted and honored to moderate this session, which will provide a historical perspective on Iran's quest for economic self-sufficiency. So it is a topic of current relevance as we witness the Iranian insistence on self-sufficiency or khud kefai on a regular basis. So I very much welcome the opportunity that we have today to add a historical dimension to this aspect. And I have the great pleasure of introducing today's speaker, who is an outstanding expert on Iran's early modern history, Professor Rudolph Matthee. So welcome, Rudi. It is wonderful to have you here. And please allow me to introduce today's speaker. Rudolph Matthee is the John and Dorothy Munroe Distinguished Professor of Middle Eastern History in the History Department at the University of Delaware. He's the author of numerous books on Safavid and Qajar Iran. For instance, he authored The Politics of Trade in Safavid Iran, Silk for Silver, 1600 to 1730, which came out in 1999 and received a book prize awarded by the Iranian Ministry of Culture, and also received an honorable mention for the British Kuwaiti Friendship Prize. Another book was published in 2005, The Pursuit of Pleasure, Drugs and Stimulants in Iranian History from 1500 to 1900. And this book received the Albert Hourani Book Prize and also the Saidi Sejani Prize. Another book is Persia in Crisis, Safavid Decline and the Fall of Isfahan, published in 2012. And this book received the British Kuwaiti Friendship Prize and also the World Book Prize awarded by the Iranian Ministry of Culture. Another book was The Monetary History of Iran, 1500 to 1925, excuse me, which Rudi Matthee co-authored with Willem Floor and Patrick Lawson. And this book received also a book award, the Hushang Pushayati Book Award. And most recently, a book with a very nice title, Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop Store, A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World. The book just came out in 2023. Rudi Matthee also edited respectively co-edited 6 volumes, most recently The Safavid World, published in 2021. And he authored more than 75 articles on various aspects of early modern Iran and Egypt. And he is co-editor of the journal Der Islam, and currently serves as the president of the Persian Heritage Foundation. And last but not least, he's also a 2-time fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, first time in 2002-03, and second time in 2017. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. And in his presentation, Professor Matthee will give us, as we have said, a historical perspective on the quest for economic self-sufficiency in Iran. And before we start with the presentation, I would like to remind again all participants to submit their questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat box. We will address your questions after Rudi Matthee's presentation. And I invite everybody from the audience to present their questions verbally. So if you want to do that, if you want to talk, please indicate this so we can change your status. And otherwise, we can also read out loud your questions, of course. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Rudi Matthee, and over to you.
Thank you, Bianca, for this kind introduction. And I would like to thank you and Mohammed Reza Farzan Far, right, for inviting me, and the organization IIEA for asking me to give this presentation. Now, I feel a little bit out of my depth because I'm a historian, and I presume I'm talking mostly to economists, so you will have to excuse me for presenting this from a historical rather than economic perspective, even though, of course, I am going to talk about the entwinement between the two, and that is really kind of the heart of my talk. I have long been fascinated by the topic of self-sufficiency, the idea of producing as much as possible within one's own country and within one's own environment. It's a topic that is, of course, not limited to Iran, and it's a kind of all times, as I argue in my piece, and arguably it's of particular relevance today in this age of globalization and the retrenchment of globalization. Again, a sort of a search for nationalist economics, closing boundaries and borders and so forth. So it's a topic of all time. So I propose today to talk really about how I came to the topic and how I developed my argument, singling out some of the important and crucial aspects of the topic, and really sort of laying out the historical roots of self-sufficiency in the Iranian case, which of course has long been recognized and identified, but typically been relegated to the 20th century. And the roots have been sought in constitutional revolution, maybe the late 19th century. But my argument is, of course, that these roots go back much further, leaping across the 18th century, which is, of course, poorly researched and is kind of a barrier in our historical understanding for lack of sources, going back to the Safavid period, which is well documented, but not necessarily incorporated in modern views of the topic. And then indeed going back way beyond, where it becomes a little bit problematic in terms of source material, but I make that leap at some risk, I admit, and I will come back to that at the end of my talk. So I was first alerted to the topic by when I studied Dutch-Iranian interaction for my dissertation and ultimately my first book, which Bianca referred to, the Silk for Silver book, negotiations between the European maritime companies and the Iranian authorities, the Safavid Shah and his entourage, where I encountered quite a bit of sort of strident rejection of the need to even engage with foreigners, in this particular case, the Dutch, mostly based on the Dutch East India Company records, of course, because unfortunately, as is always almost the case, there is a severe and problematic lack of indigenous Persian language sources. And this holds for the entire topic, and it makes things awkward at times. But still, to come back to the topic, what I encountered a lot in these records, in the negotiations, long records, long accounts of these negotiations, sometimes in the form of diaries, day to day, is this kind of prickly attitude on the part of the Iranians, sticking to their guns, you know, in terms of the contract that the Dutch had signed, and they weren't abiding by it. Of course, the Dutch arguing that the Iranians were not abiding by the contract, which is precisely why they held these sort of prolonged negotiations. Iranian perception, or the attitude, was ultimately, well, we don't need your outside junk. It's superfluous. And if you don't like being here, then you can pack up and we will be perfectly fine, sort of summing up. And this was not simply one instance. This is a pervasive and recurrent motif in these negotiations, all the way from the very beginning, almost from the very beginning, certainly from the 1650s and 1660s onwards, and really continuing beyond the fall of the Safavids. You find the same kind of attitude even under Nadir Shah. Of course, the Dutch stay in Iran until the 1750s, so even beyond the Nadir Shah period. So there's a recurrent motif there that pricked my interest, and that I took note of. It was not necessarily part of my first book, but I made these peripheral annotations for perhaps a later article, which then came 30 years later. Then I encountered the topic again, the theme again, when I worked on the 19th century, mostly reading travel reports, travel accounts, British, French, German, Dutch, anything. In addition to Persian chronicles, again, thin on the ground, but they do exist, of course. I identified the same kind of attitude in a slightly different context at the time, because in the 19th century, we have the beginning of a more self-conscious rejection of the West. It begins to take the form of a sort of a proto-nationalist attitude. We begin to have the idea of a nation, not a nation state still in the modern sense of the word, but a more clearly defined territorial entity. And it really mostly goes back to the reign of Muhammad Shah, 1834 to 48, where we begin to see this reaction to the actual intrusion of the British and the Russians, which is, of course, quite severe and accelerating at the time. The Russians, I think in 1828, as part of the Treaty of Turkomanchai, extract tax and toll concessions from the Iranians. The British follow suit in 1841. Iranian market becomes flooded with their products, with their manufactured products, mostly textiles, but implements of any kind of type, edging out Iranian manufacturing. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned on the part of the authorities, and this is reflected in Muhammad Shah's, in the period of Muhammad Shah in particular, taking the form of the beginning of the idea of import substitution, the notion that Iranians should only dress with textiles produced in their own country, and they can actually do well without all these foreign imports, which indeed are flooding the market at the time. In other words, they focus on domestic manufacturing. And this, of course, leads very quickly to the period of the brief tenure of Amir Kabir, the famous chief minister of Nasruddin Shah, from 1848 until 52, when he's assassinated. And he sort of puts a fine point on this, and he begins to engage in an active import substitution type of domestic manufacturing. It's nipped in the bud, of course. It's a flash in the pan. It doesn't endure because it's bound up with the person and the individual and his own energy and his enterprise and his initiative. There's no real court support for this, but still, it's an important impulse, I think. And then, I began to see patterns, in other words. But I also began to realize that this attitude of rejecting foreign imports and emphasizing the need for domestic production was not simply an economic issue, but it was inextricably bound up with cultural values and preconceived notions. The idea of Iran as a bountiful country, rich in natural resources, of verdant landscapes, very productive, and this is all before oil, of course, a country that would thrive if only foreign powers left it alone and didn't meddle in its affairs. That kind of sums up an attitude which was already instinctively expressed, I think, in the 17th century in these negotiations with the Dutch and also the English. At the time, the East India Company, English East India Company, was, of course, also active in Iran, but it becomes better articulated and more well-defined and self-consciously expressed in the 19th century. But that is really the core, I think, of what I'm arguing, which is, of course, a slippery notion, because culture is, by definition, something that one cannot quantify, and that when one uses it, one exposes oneself to severe criticism. And I'll come back to that, and maybe there are questions in the at the end. Presentation about this. By the way, culture then also includes religion, as far as I'm concerned, because of course Iran occupies a very peculiar and even unique position within the Middle East and within the Islamic world. It's, after all, the only Shi'i country expressly and officially articulated Shi'i country, 12 Shi'i in the entire Islamic world. So it has this peculiar, unique position, and it gives it a very self-conscious sense of being different, surrounded also by hostile neighbors, oftentimes Arabs on the one hand, Turks to the north, Uzbeks, Afghans, and so forth. And I think that enhances this idea, not simply of being singular, unique, different, but also being threatened by outside forces. And I think that plays a role in this whole construct as well. So then I began to look for roots. I'm a historian, as I pointed out, and historians look for roots. It doesn't mean that roots are destiny, but, you know, it's interesting and important, usually, to find antecedents to phenomena that one studies. So I was struck reading about the revolution, meaning the Iranian revolution of 1978-79, which I witnessed myself, by the way, because I was a student in Iran in 1976-77, an exchange student from Holland, which is, of course, my home country. And I went back to Iran, not numerous times, a few times during and in the midst of the revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, 1979, 1981. So this was lived experience to some extent. So I was struck really by, for example, Khomeini's perception of the economy, his lack of sophistication, his real lack of understanding of a modern economy, and the similarity in the way he expressed his notions about economic life and the need for an economic policy with pre-modern ideas, which of course can be summed up as the idea of the household economy, Aristotle's idea, his conception of the economy being a matter of an equilibrium within the household. You know, income and expenditure should be in balance, and transactions with the outside world are only important in as far as they're needed to correct an imbalance. So it ideally as much comes in as goes out. So that is a very sort of limited notion of the economy that, of course, held sway throughout the world for long periods of time in East and West. This is not simply a matter of Islam or the Middle East. Europeans, too, followed that pattern pretty much really until the 17th century in some ways, and in some ways held on to it much longer. And there's still remnants of that notion that, you know, we wall ourselves off from the outside world and we'll be fine. Precisely the idea of self-sufficiency, right? Now, then I went back, having sort of fastened onto Aristotle, read about his conception and his position in the ancient world and beyond. I made an effort to connect that notion to the pre-Islamic Iranian Islamic Middle East and its idea of the economy, to the extent that we can figure this out, because of course there's almost no there are almost no writings about the economy because it was never seen as a separate entity, as a separate discipline that even in the West only began in early modern periods. The economy is separate from a moral concept and part of moral philosophy. It's a very spotty thing to investigate that for the pre-Islamic Middle East. But still, to the extent that you can say something about it, it really goes back again to this idea of a verdant core, the oasis notion, a blooming, flourishing, tiny, carefully cultivated and curated oasis, a garden, a bar, with a hose, with a pond in the middle, beautiful sort of microcosm in the midst of a hostile desert-like environment, a verdant paradise in the midst of a wasteland. It's not for nothing, of course, that the word paradise is derived from it's a Persian notion, right? And so this is no longer theory. If you look at the actual landscape of Iran and much of the Middle East, not all of the Middle East, it corresponds to that. It's a difficult, it's a rebarbative environment. It is not easy to produce. It's a hostile environment. It's nomadic. It's very tribal. So you have to husband your resources, and the life, and that includes economic life, is focused, located, and concentrated in oasis culture. And that almost automatically means some kind of self-sufficiency, because the moment you leave that oasis, you expose yourself to banditry, to the hostile elements, heat and drought, and so forth. So it's not for nothing that Iran today still has, the city as its identity core. You're from Isfahan, you're from Kashan, you're from Tabriz, and you derive a certain pride from that. And that has long antecedents, because again, it goes back to this idea that civilization is really located in this oasis culture, in the oasis writ large. The center and sort of the bustan, the productive surrounding area, still well watered, because of course that's the essential component, water. Hence the hose, of course, at the center of the bar, if you want to sort of extend that metaphor. And so then I branched out beyond Iran, because I think much of this is not necessarily just focused on Iran or limited to Iran. It's Mesopotamian, the whole idea of the cycle of justice, which plays into this. What is a ruler to do? He is supposed to bring prosperity and abundance to the land through managing and husbanding his resources well, with his Grand Vizier as his sidekick. The Grand Vizier is really that is his first obligation. And of course, he has to, fulfill a number of obligations in order to make the cycle run and continue and perpetuate itself. Be kind, or at least equitable to the peasants. Make sure you have a well protected realm. In other words, you have to take care of your military, and all that costs a lot of money. So you have to create productivity and enhance it. And so that's how the cycle goes and continues, and how a civilized society proceeds. Now, there's, of course, an Islamic element that comes in the 7th century of the Christian era, but that, I think, sort of automatically, not automatically, but integrates these preceding notions and simply puts a sort of a moral stamp on it. There isn't much as Islamic economic thinking independently, to the extent that it exists. Again, there's the moral element. If you want to gain points in paradise, you fulfill these obligations, and you meet the standards that have been identified centuries earlier in terms of justice and being equitable in terms of being the ruler, because ultimately you have a mandate from the heavens to be a just ruler in this world. To the extent that it's concrete, I think the Islamic elements, just as the preceding pre-Islamic element is focused on kind of physiocratic, attributes. It's very much focused on lands and landed property and agriculture and so forth, but no radical break. It's kind of it adds a moral dimension to existing sets of patterns. So having surveyed all of this in the course of time, and this is not a matter of months, but it sort of builds up over the years, and I've done lots of other work, so it's, lots of sideways that ultimately, brought out this essay. And I also have one on capitalism, or the lack thereof in the 19th century, which is another offshoot of the same line of thinking, in a book that came out a few years ago. But anyway, so then I connected the dots, and I ended up finding more and more elements. I began to read in my survey of sources, some of which had nothing to do with this particular topic, but I kept an eye to this particular topic, and I ended up extracting lots more information, finding elements that fit into the same pattern that I just described, of basically rejecting the foreign elements, meaning, focusing on self-reliance, amid an enormous receptivity to the same foreign elements in other ways. And I need to emphasize that, because the last thing I want to be seen as, or certainly accused of, as looking at Iranians as xenophobic, because what I've described so far and outlined so far goes in that direction, certain rejection of outside elements and outside influence and so forth, and a sort of a pride, we can do this ourselves, we don't need you, and so forth, all of which is true. But I think the paradox, and for me the beauty and the intrigue and the fascination of Iran, is precisely the fact that this exists alongside with and intersecting with an enormous amount of receptivity and attractiveness to outside influence, and a capaciousness in absorbing outside influence, fashion, novelty, and so forth. So it's both rejection and seduction. It's a xenophobia and xenophilia, which I think needs a lot more work, and this is just a little piece of that. So I wanted to insert that, so as not to be seen as simply, talking about Iran as a country that inherently rejects foreign influence. Far from it. Now, the other thing I found, and again, this sort of reinforced my argument, I think, is the textiles. Very important components, a very long-standing focal point of this tension between imports and exports, and resentment and unhappiness with the state of affairs. Iran can produce its textiles itself. There's no question about it. Most beautiful textiles left from the Safavid and the Qajar period and so forth. And yet it imported textiles from the Safavid period onward, and in an accelerating manner since from the 19th century onward. Perhaps lower in quality, but also lower in price, and of course, price always counts more than quality in the end, at least for most people who cannot afford luxury goods. So textiles are also have a certain quality, because they're, first of all, they're important for attire. They're the essence of attire. There's no clothing without textiles. And you see this tension, this conflict between domestic manufacturing and the desire to focus on that and limit manufacturing to domestic productivity on the one hand, and foreign imports in the 19th century, but already in the 18th century, but especially in the 19th century, and where it becomes enhanced by this idea of najasat, meaning ritual purity, where Islam, Shia Islam, comes in. Twelver Shia Islam has always been preoccupied by the idea of ritual impurity. Shias are pure, outsiders are impure. It's not about Christians, because it holds for Sunni Muslims as well. And this was an important issue. It's oftentimes overlooked, and it's fallen by the wayside, from in the 20th century. But until then, this was a big deal. Any foreigner going to Iran was well advised to bring, for example, his own water pipe, mouthpiece, because the water pipe going around is inherently a communal thing. And people were told, before you go to Iran, get your own mouthpiece, because if you don't, Iranians are obliged to be hospitable and invite you to their sessions, but it's also going to be awkward. The water pipe goes around and you are still an infidel. You are najis, meaning you are ritually impure, and that creates problems for your host. So just make things easy by bringing your own mouthpiece, so you don't have to share the actual implement, because, you know, smoke goes through water in the water pipe, so it enters the body. And that becomes important ultimately for dress, for textiles as well. It becomes an issue in the Constitutional Revolution, in the tobacco revolt that proceeds in the late 19th century, and in general, you see, and I think I give a number of examples in my article, that especially the clergy, the Ahuns, are very upset and very worked up about this particular aspect when it comes to textiles, because textiles absorb sweat, and it's the sweat of infidels, and therefore imported textiles are taboo, are, you know, it's like tobacco revolt on the part of the clerics, not the merchants and the intellectuals. They had different motives, they have different reasons for rejecting imports, or the, you know, the concession that the Shah gave to this foreign firm, Talbot. For them, it was, you know, it's purely economic. But for the clerics, it was both economic, because of course they owned tobacco farms in the south, but it was mostly a moral issue. This idea that tobacco that goes through the body would be processed and packaged and distributed and exported by foreigners, by infidels. So in that sense, the focus on textiles in this quest for self-sufficiency, it makes sense and becomes very important and relevant. So having looked at all of this, I came to understand the battle cry of, I came to understand, first of all, Khomeini's notion that the economy is for donkeys, you know, his famous bon mot, because he truly, I think, looked at the economy as a matter of the household, the Aristotelian notion, you know, simple, basic, not complex, and easily managed. You just keep the lid on, so to speak. And it ultimately amounts to shared austerity, which I think was part of his plan in a way, because I think Khomeini feared more than anything the idea of modern Western capitalism, of more and more and more, and, you know, sort of a hedonistic search for pleasure and indulgence, which is of course inherent in capitalism. And I began to understand also the notion of iqtisad muqawamat of Khamenei, which still, of course, is a core element of Iran's economic policy, at least rhetorically. All of which was, of course, vividly displayed on banners hanging, you know, from roads, highways during my last visit to Iran in 2019, and probably still is. I haven't really checked in the last couple of years. This and ultimately the sort of the overall slogan of the Islamic Revolution, the Na Gharbi Na Sharqi Jumhuri Islami, which I think goes to the heart really of this idea of, you know, Iran being a singular, unique nation that can take care of itself as long as it's not being intruded upon by foreign forces, and will be thriving again if it's left alone. So that is basically the argument I make in the article. I had two concerns, and I still have those concerns, and I tried to take care of them while writing, and after submitting them to some critics, because I did get some criticism on these notions. And the first is, and I'm you know, submitting these perhaps as points of discussion. What I wanted to avoid is the idea of a static notion, that this is kind of a, you know, a core element of the Iranian psyche from beginning to end, from Khursh Kabir until Khamenei, so to speak, on the one hand. And the other one, my other concern, connected, of course, is the idea of teleology, this idea that there's just a unilinear trajectory here. And again, this is, you know, sort of at the heart of it. And I try to avoid that by arguing and demonstrating, I think, that while the core elements persists, some of the core element is I desire to well, be left alone to produce as much as possible within the own household, so to speak, the own community. Doesn't have to be the household as such. This, of course, is oftentimes what I try to show is that this is, subject to enormous change and variation over time, because you have to look at it, all of it, within political, economic, societal, and environmental context. And if you don't do that, you would indeed end up with sort of a static notion that is completely divorced from reality. So I try to take care of that. And the other thing that I referred to a number of times, and I think it's also meant to perhaps preempt criticism, is this idea that a lot of this amounts to rhetoric, that it's a rhetorical device that oftentimes doesn't necessarily reflect reality. The Islamic Republic, of course, is a perfect example of that. This Iqtisad al-Muqawamat is a slogan. It's a rhetorical device, and it's repeated endlessly, which is what makes it a rhetorical device. But it doesn't necessarily correspond to reality, because it's very clear that shortly after the revolution of 79 coming to fruition, and the initial period of chaos and bewilderment, we've won, and what are we going to do now? The economists, quote unquote, took over, and they couldn't sideline Khomeini, but they kind of ignored his economy is for donkeys, and the price, what was this other one? The revolution wasn't fought for the price of melons, and began to pursue the notion of a modern economy, which of course inherently means dealing with the world and with prices and inflation and so forth. I'm not saying they've been successful, but at least they have engaged in a set of modern policies that in the end have nothing to do with just self-sufficiency. And I think that's very important too. This idea that, this becomes a sort of a talking point, and it's eternally repeated as a slogan for, popular and populist purposes, not necessarily reflecting reality. I think it's also an important caveat, if you want to call it that. So I don't know. I have talked for about 35 minutes, and so maybe I should stop here and entertain questions and comments.
Thank you very much. What is really very interesting and very inspiring presentation, which covered a broad historical span over the centuries, and also traced the roots of the enduring Iranian insistence for economic self-sufficiency. So thank you very much. And I just want to add a first short remark. As you have mentioned, the paradox of Iran simultaneously rejecting outside elements and at the same time absorbing outside influences on a very strong basis. So I found that very important point, and certainly a fundamental aspect that helps us to describe the Iranian modern period. And now you have also highlighted the pre-modern dimension of this point. So that's just a first remark. But what is also interesting for me is I want to come back to your argument of the cultural exceptionalism of Iran, which also includes religion. So a topic which is also interesting for me within my own research on the Pahlavi period. But going back to the Safavid period, we have the during the Safavid period, the strong connection also, this connection between economics and foreign policy, and you have worked a lot with the records regarding the Dutch foreign economic relations. And another important step during the Safavid period was the introduction of Shia Islam into Iran, so laying also an important foundation for the later religious exceptionalism of the country. To what extent does religion play a role in these foreign political economic relations? Did you encounter instances of such a articulation, self-representation in your sources?
That's a good question. And the answer is very little. And I think that's also a very important and even a pivotal element in Iranian political economy and statecraft, quite frankly, which also runs through time, by the way, I think, and pertains even today, you know, with some qualification. In the Safavid period, religion plays a very important role. It has to, because of course, it's a state founded on religious principles in some ways, right? Rhetorically speaking, it's a Safavid, a Shah Ismail, who introduces Twelver Shi'ism as a state religion, proclaims it in Tabriz in 1501. And then, of course, initially they have no idea what it means. So they have to import clerics from Jabal Amil in Lebanon and from Bahrain and so forth to basically teach them the tenets of the faith. But, you know, this is part and parcel of a movement of the Safavids from being a nomadic, mobile formation to an agriculturally based, centralized, you know, less mobile dispensation, right? But religion remains at the core of this in a way, and it actually is enhanced in some ways in terms of rhetorical ornamentation towards the end of the period. And the Shah, Sultan Hussein, who was, you know, particularly susceptible to the influence of the clerics and the eunuchs and so forth. And then it really begins to play a role in statecraft. In other words, the Shah lets himself very much be influenced by the clerics. But that's a fairly new thing, because you look at Shah Abbas, both the first and the second, and Shah Safi, you know, they paid lip service to religion and they went through the motions. They had to, you know, abide by the rules. They had to go to the mosque and, you know, and present and project themselves as believing rulers. But effectively, their will to power was secular. And there are plenty of examples of that. In other words, the Shah was in charge. And a proper and a successful Shah, Shah Abbas I being the most important one, knew how to divide and rule and keep all the very different factions in balance. And that included the clerics, who had to know their place. And if they didn't, they could be called to the court, and some were actually executed. So yeah, it was a very clear division of labor. You know, I'm in charge. I will let you play a role. And, you know, you take care of the sort of the spiritual well-being of the populace, and I will take care of the military and the governmental affairs. And the thing is, of course, that the clerics by and large agreed with that, because there has been from time immemorial in Iran, this kind of tacit understanding of a division of labor, precisely along those lines. The Shah and his entourage, the military, the bureaucracy, they run the country. The ulama provide a sort of a moral element, but it's limited. They cannot really interfere in statecraft, and if they do, the Shah pulls rank. So in these discussions, to come back to your question, there's very little religion because the Sheikh Ali Khan, for example, you know, major chief minister, Wazir Azam in the late 17th century, he holds these discussions with the Dutch. And religion simply does not play a role. It's never invoked. It's purely political. It's purely, you know, a power game. You know, it's negotiations between statesmen. So in that sense, it's completely absent. And then, of course, you know, it varies a little bit, but not that much, because he's followed by Mirza Muhammad, forget his last name, Anyway, as Grand Vizier, who's a cleric himself, and who's not personally involved as much as Sheikh Ali Khan was with the Dutch and the English, but still he's a cleric, but nothing fundamentally changes. So that is really the answer to the question. not much visible by way of religious articulation and influence.
Thank you very much. We have some questions in the Q&A section. I think we can start with Mohammad Jahan Parvar, and I invite you to ask your question verbally if you would like to, or should I read it for you?
Yeah, Mohammed can speak, I
Yeah,
guess.
okay, that's fine.
His audio is active.
Myself. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much for letting me ask the question directly. So the trade deficit in textiles is actually an issue that dates back to about 16th century throughout the Mediterranean basin, and further east in Iran with India. So that consistent trade deficit in textile actually existed for a long time. And over time, of course, it caused dislocation of labor and loss of many jobs to trading partners. So in that sense, and in both Ottoman lands and in Iran, there was a call for potential support or promotion of textile industry throughout the 18th and 19th century.
Right.
In that sense, what's the point of essentially showcasing Iran while something very, very similar was going on both in Egypt and in Syria, the Levant the region. On the other hand, it seems that the watershed moment for this type of protectionist, if you will, policies date back to what happened after World War I. In the breakdown of the first era of globalization, the Russian Revolution in 1917, and then disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, the closing of the trade routes that Iran had established over years to Europe in the West and North. That caused severe hardship economically. And it seems that calls for more self-sufficiency and more self-reliance based on written evidence seem to have actually picked up after that period, and they were actually enacted to some extent during the Reza Shah's regime. Just wanted to point out that it seems to be more a reaction to the breakdown of the trade system, rather than, at least to my knowledge, seems to be more a reaction to the breakdown in the trade system pretty early in the 20th century, rather than something that goes back all the way to 17th.
Well, I'm not sure how to react to that. I think it's the one doesn't exclude the other necessarily. As I pointed out, I try in the article to pay attention to fluctuations in economic policy, in world markets, perhaps not enough, but certainly I try to link this theme to actual events on the ground, whether economic or political and so forth. And yes, it's definitely true that certainly from the 16th and certainly in a documented way from the 17th century, there has been a trade deficit. It's also not limited to Iran, I know that. But of course, my article is about Iran. That would be a different article to talk about the sort of general and overarching developments throughout the Middle East beyond Iran. And yes, I think it's also true that a lot of this instinctive protectionism and a focus on the need for domestic production results from simply scarcity and need and immiseration. If you are cut off from the world, then you have no choice but to make your own implements, even though they would be cheaper and more easily available from abroad if these trade links would exist. But I'm not sure if there is a contradiction between that and my argument that there is also, a cultural element, and I didn't really bring this out in my spoken presentation, but it's more so reflected in the article. I think this idea of Iranians having a very sort of what's the term, a somewhat inflated sense of self in terms of their own country and its abilities and its productivity. This idea of a country of abundance, that could easily produce everything itself, that is, overflowing with money, and it's simply threatened by outside powers who are trying to intervene and rob it of its resources and its wealth and so forth. And if those would go away, everything would be fine. The very idea of a verdant Iran, which still exists, by the way, in the minds of many, if not most Iranians, needs to be qualified. Iran was a very poor country in many ways. It was not objectively resource poor, because of course the soil is riddled with minerals. There was an article in New York Times yesterday about it, about lithium, being found in Iran. It was just a matter of, extracting it, producing it, making it workable. There was an attempt to reopen mines, copper mines. There's plenty of copper in Iran, near Kerman, for example. But, the technology wasn't there. The infrastructure was lacking. The political will wasn't there to coordinate policies in the 17th century. That's all documented, right? So they imported copper from Japan, right? Now, why is that? Because there was also this element of a government that was not necessarily aligned with private enterprise and entrepreneurship to galvanize kind of, an initiative leading to a leap, if you will. But again, coming back to this point, Iran was ultimately, before oil, of course, a very resource poor country. There was always this deficit. There was actually a surplus with the Ottoman Empire and with Russia, but there was a gaping and a yawning deficit with India forever. And that was always there. That was structural and unchanging. But again, it goes against this notion that, this Nowruz idea of Iran, it's this verdant spring, eternal spring, very, very productive. And, if outside powers would interfere with us, we'd be not just the most civilized, but also the most productive country in the world, which is not matched by reality, really. Again, before oil became a resource in the 20th century. So that is also part of my argument.
So it seems that your argument is, the way that I see this is that there seems to be an issue of the deterioration of terms of trade over time, and at least some talk of trying to stem this deterioration.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. See, the 19th century, Iran, it's inherently hard to quantify, even economics in pre-modern times, right? Because we don't have figures. All we have is some writings here and there, some pronouncements. But you assume that Iran in the 17th century was relatively well off, by and large. 18th century put a huge dent in that. It was a century of turmoil after the fall of the Safavids. We have all these warlords running around. Now there's Shah, who's immensely destructive and extortionate, even though he brings in enormous wealth from India still. Iran is depleted. It's an impoverished country. And then we get some more of these guys, right, running around. The Qajars aren't necessarily better. Muhammad Shah is not exactly, a paragon of good governance, right, and economic stimulus and so forth. So the 19th century is still a period of great misery. And then, of course, this is exacerbated by these periodic droughts and famines, 1860s, 1870s, and so forth, sustained mismanagement by the rulership, right? And so, that has nothing to do with the inherent genius of the Iranians and their entrepreneurship and their initiative. It's a systemic thing, a combination of weakness, which of course begins with military weakness and being defeated by the Russians, and in a way being cut off for a century or more from the currents of world history. There's enormous change in the world, in Europe, both in statecraft and in economic, flows around the world, let alone in the 19th century. And Iran doesn't really take part of that. The other thing I'd like to emphasize, I hadn't talked about that, but I think it also bears reflection, is that Iran's environment is not exactly well suited to easy globalization. I'm not talking about today, where you just fly there within 12 hours, so to speak, but Iran doesn't have easy access to the oceans. Persian Gulf is hot and humid and barely habitable, right? There's a reason why no Hong Kong or Singapore emerged in Bandar Abbas and Bushehr. It's a very difficult climate. The political centers were still 600-700 miles to the north, right? This is always the example that I use in my classes too, to make this visible and tangible. Imagine if you want to import, say, a printing press in the 19th century, right? You've got onto the idea of printing, important printing press comes from Europe, of course, right? If you're the Ottoman Empire, you order the damn thing in France, it's brought to Marseille, you put it on a boat to Istanbul, takes 5 days, right? You unload it, you're in business. Iran, what do you do in Iran? You order it in France, same thing. Before the Suez Canal, 1860s, how does it go? It has to go all the way around the Cape, okay? Then it first has to go to India because of the monsoon winds. Everything always went to India first. And then from Mumbai, it had to go to the Persian Gulf, right? And then you unload it in Bandar Abbas, but you still have, 900 kilometers to go to Isfahan over very difficult terrain. Have you ever seen these pictures of these kotals from Bushehr across the mountains before roads were built? I mean, donkeys, right, going up, endlessly and then going down again. So in terms of infrastructure, and there were no roads, of course, really far into the 20th century, not even talk about railroads, that's 20th century. So Iran was in a very precarious position. Ottoman Empire, even within, you could, use the Black Sea, go to Trabzon, and from there take things to Erzurum, to the Far East, so to speak. Iran through Russia, talk about difficult. Half the year you couldn't even move. So I think that aspect gets far too little attention on the part of scholars, and that includes certainly Iranian scholars. There's very little attention to the sort of the built environment, the actual natural environment, and the difficulty of vast deserts, high mountains, inaccessible terrain, and so forth. I think it plays a very, very important role.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So we have another question or remark by Esfandiar Masumi, and I invite him to ask his question verbally also.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
Still morning here. Well, just about noon.
Thank you so much for this erudite and thought-provoking presentation. I was pleased to see that you're sensitized to the criticism that your analysis may imply that you think there's something constant in the Persian character in terms of how its attitude has been, because I believe there's been evolution in that, which is both historically evidenced, but also observable even as we speak. You think of the US attitude about free trade and self-sufficiency 20 years ago versus China compared to today. My theory is that you like trade and interchanges with other cultures and tribes when you win, and you don't like it so much when you lose. And a lot of the Persian psyche and its grandiosity comes from a lost empire, and it follows with the Arab invasion, and then the killer blow, Mongol invasion. It takes centuries to absorb all of those, but these rekindle my thought that history and geography is everything. It's funny for an economist to say that. But history is also a question of human capital. You rightly mentioned that there is a grandiose view of Persians about how self-sufficient, how rich Iran is. But compared to small European countries that became empires, I think the difference is human capital and how it's related to history, not so much to geography and resources. So those are mostly comments, but I wanted to thank you and say that you've gotten me to feel reinforced about some of my views of history and geography being very important.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I'd like to make a few extra comments or additional comments to that. First of all, oh gosh, now I lose my train of thought. Well, yes, human capital, I think it's extremely important and really crucial. Well, first of all, you know, I don't think it's part of the, now I regain my train of thought. It's not a matter of Persian character, of course. It's a matter of Persian, you know, a Persian model of statecraft and economic thoughts that ultimately becomes part of the historical bloodstream, but it's not part of the DNA, you know, it's not genetic, you know, that's something that needs to be discarded right there. Secondly, yes, you're of course totally right. You know, if you're a winner, you're for open trade. Look at the Dutch in the 17th century. They preached mare liberum, open seas, because they ruled the seas, right? The British took over in the 18th century, same thing. You know what I mean? If you stand to gain, you're going to be generous, right? And the United States is repeating the same pattern now. Now they're on the losing side, and now they're becoming more mercantilist and more protectionist. So that is definitely also a theme through history, and it has nothing to do with Iran as such. Now, your last point, I think, is the most important one. Human capital, I think that really is the crux of the matter. You know, there's an enormous human potential for human capital in Iran, as is shown. You know, you have this notion that, you know, if only this government would go or would reform itself substantially, you know, this country would indeed flourish, because resources, including mineral resources alone, are not the secret. Look at Japan, nothing to show for, and a thriving country. I mean, a problematic country in many ways, but, you know, economically without peer, Benazir, right, in the post-war period. So Iran could play the same role, right, in many ways. What I think has been lacking, and I bring this out in the article that I just mentioned, and maybe it might be of interest to you. It came out in this book, Capitalisms. I can give you the reference. I can actually send the PDF of the article if people are interested, where I talk about the 19th century and again try to, you know, find the historical roots, salbiqeh, you know, antecedents. And I argue in that article, among other things, that, you know, what is lacking in Iran, and not just in Iran, but in the Middle East writ large, as compared to Europe, if you want to make a comparison, because ultimately you will have to explain why capitalism originated in Europe, right? And not in the Middle East, and not even in China, right? And I very much like the arguments, the ideas of Joel Mokyr, who argues that what the Europeans unlocked was this interest in useful knowledge, applied knowledge. There was a great deal of interest in technology in Iran, and in debate, and in discovery and so forth, but it all sort of remained on an ethereal, idealized and idealist plane. You know, there were, of course, elements of applied knowledge, astronomy and so forth, but they were typically put in the service of religion, you know, to determine the position of the moon for prayer and Ramadan and so forth. But applied knowledge, also an interest in handicraft and real work with one's hands, was very much lacking in the Islamic world. And that's what Europe unlocked, this idea that it's, you know, how things are made and how they're applied, the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of technology is really the secret of technology. That's also why just importing a plant and then hoping for the best and going like this doesn't work. You know, you have to keep applying. You have to be engaged in the actual nitty-gritty of applied knowledge. And I think that he's onto something. And I worked that out for Iran a little bit in the article. So I'll stop talking about that. So I'd like to hear what people think of that particular argument. So thank you for the question. Very thoughtful.
Thank you very much. We have another question on my list. The next, we have several questions. So the next person who has asked the question is Hashem Pesaran. So I invite you to ask your question.
Well, thanks so much. A very interesting talk. Touches a lot of deep issues that we all appreciate to listen to you. Thank you very much. I think I mean, I think you pointed out a number of historical undercurrent of what your position is, which is correct, because Iranians are very suspicious of foreigners. Doesn't mean they don't like foreign technology or foreigners. I mean, there's two distinct views. Yes. And because historically we have been subjugated to a lot of invasion and domination and so on. Not that we are the only country in the world. We forgot what I mean,
precisely. That's the history of the world.
Sitting in Cambridge, England, I know that British have been all over the place. That the Dutch been, the Spanish, the Portuguese. So anyway, I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I think it's right for Iranian to be suspicious. The reason one of the reasons behind the revolution, the 1917 revolution, the way I understood it, was they thought Shah is the lucky of the West, and therefore it would not necessarily serve the interest of Iranians. I mean, of course, it doesn't follow one way or the other. So I think I actually went after the Iran-Iraq war ended and gave a lot of talks because of the reconstruction. And I think one of the fundamental issues which was raised, that's why I made the comment that I want to know what you think, whether you allow it for your analysis, because it seemed to me both the person who introduced you and yourself, you use the word self-sufficiency and self-reliance interchangeably. I just don't, I think that's the issue. I think it's so important to distinguish between the two, because by self-reliance, it means I don't rely on foreign forces or so on. That doesn't mean I do not want to trade on equal rights.
Right.
Turkmenchai, I always give an example. Say, if liberalism and liberal economy is a good idea, why is that Iran has to lose a war so that they impose Turkmenchai agreement on Iran, right? So therefore, I think this is related. So I think I like you to, I don't know whether you do it in your analysis. I think there are two different concepts. Iranian could be self-reliant, but nevertheless engage in trade, engage in all sorts of interchange of ideas. Look, the way Iranian missile industry has developed, it was because they had to be self-reliant. Didn't mean they didn't use technology. In fact, the world is doing everything they could at the moment. So stop Iran have access to technology.
Right. Well, okay, if you allow me, I agree with you to some extent, and I think I do make that distinction in the article. I forgot to make it because there is, of course, Khud Kefai, and there's Khud Etikai, and then there's Khud Bavari, and there are three different concepts, and they're used not necessarily interchangeably in Iran. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I do make some remarks about that. And so, yes, it's very true. It really goes back to this notion of the paradox in a way. There's this immense fascination with the West, which, by the way, doesn't begin in 1900 or even in 1800. That is already very much visible in the Safavid period. There's an intense interest in Christianity and a willingness to debate with Jesuits and with merchants and diplomats and so forth, something you do not see in the Ottoman Empire, by the way, not at all. Because the Turks are much more dogmatic and strict and, averse to having their own ideas questioned or debated. That is singular to Iran. There's a little bit of that in the Mughal Empire, but not as much. Iran really stands out, this willingness to sit with all these foreigners. Shah Abbas, ask what is the cross? He's immensely fascinated by the Bible and the iconography of Christianity. And then the goblets with the wine goes around, which is unthinkable anywhere else. So there is that element it goes beyond simply hospitality. It's an intense curiosity about the outside world, which still is there. You look at what's going on right now in Iran, or since the revolution in a way, there's this tension between this government that tries to restrict and control and so forth, and this population that wants to burst out, globalized, connected, and so forth. So yeah, all that has to be brought in, and I think I tried to do that. Maybe I didn't do it enough.
No, it was just the wording. I think it's very important not.
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely, because I
think that the contradiction disappears in my view as soon as you realize that there is the Iranian are suspicious of the foreign manipulation, but nevertheless they want to engage. The question is, how do you break the balance between the two?
Yeah, that's true. But then the question is, where does this fear of manipulation come from? Because that too precedes the 19th century, where there obviously were good reasons and under the Shah, the Mohammad Reza, to be suspicious of foreigners, because yes, they did interfere, they did mingle, but in the 17th century, these foreigners, I always resist this notion that sometimes Iranians bring up, the Dutch were imperialists in the 17th. They were not imperialists. They came there with one ship with 50 people and 3 cannons, and they were confronted with a very powerful state. What were they going to do? Start shooting around? They tried a couple of times and they lost. So this is not imperialism. They had to beg and, with great humility, go to the court and hope to get some concessions from the Shah, who could revoke these at a moment's notice. That's not imperialism. Maybe it sows the seeds of imperialism because, of course, with it comes a cognitive mapping of the country and an amount of knowledge that is not reciprocated about Iran, right? That lays the groundwork for later intervention. But you have to be careful there too. So where does this suspicion come from? Because it's already there. But, it's also suspicion about one another. It's not simply vis-a-vis foreign powers. And as an Iranian, I think you'll have to admit that too, that Iranians are not simply suspicious vis-a-vis foreign powers, but also vis-a-vis one another. I'll leave it at that. But, I think that's an important component of it as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So the next question comes from Masoud Shanaz.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for, as usual, very erudite and interesting presentation. I'm not a historian, but I've been reading a lot of works by historians, and one tendency which I have noticed since the appearance of Islamic Republic, which I would like to hear your thoughts about it, is that some people have tried to reinterpret the Iranian history in the light of what has happened during the Islamic Republic. You mentioned teleology. This is a kind of backward teleology. Mm-hmm. Some even have written books on modern history of Iran, which starts from, oddly enough, from Safavid era. Mm-hmm. And then, and then there are other people who try to find elements which we see within the Islamic Republic by rereading history. And of course, when you search for certain ideas, you'll find, and particularly when there is a paucity of information, you always find what you're looking for. And, as you mentioned yourself, Iran was on the Silk Road, there was a lot of trade, so there must have been other ideas also. But if you look at, if you're searching for the ideas that are now prevalent within the official discourse of the Islamic Republic, then we'll find them. As the late Hamid Enayat mentioned, actually the Islamic Republic, it's an innovation in Iranian history.
Very much so, yes.
In itself is an innovation. So,
totally.
So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. But if you look at the more modern times, we have more information. We see that Iran actually hasn't been very different from other parts of the world. For example, look at the Reza Shah's period. During his first part of Reza Shah's rule, Iran was an open economy, invited foreign investment, etc., but none was forthcoming, of course. Mm-hmm. But as soon as the World Depression in the early 1930s, along with other Latin American countries, Turkey and other countries, it was forced to adopt import substitution industrialization. During the time of his successor, we see actually a lot of open to foreign investment, etc. So I just would like to hear your thoughts about this sort of new tendencies within the Iranian history. Right. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'll keep it brief because this is, of course, a huge topic we could talk about for hours. But I however much we all are products of our own time and caught and cast in that mold, and it's very difficult to escape from it because it's like water surrounding you when you swim, right? Or being a fish you don't know there's water, you don't know what it is. It's still, of course, like all good historians, I try to step out of it and not read history backwards. Again, it's difficult not to do that, but we should make an effort. And so I totally resist this idea of projecting ideas about the Islamic Republic or the way it's been operating onto the past. And I fully agree with Inayat and others who have said the same thing, that it's an innovation. The whole idea of Wilayat Faqih, of course, is completely constructed. I mean, there are elements there in Shia Islam, but the very idea that this should be the core of political culture is complete innovation. It's revolutionary. In that sense, too, the revolution was revolutionary. There's nothing there. And I pointed out, for example, this sort of unwritten pact between the clerics and the rulers that pertains pretty much throughout history. Division of labor, it was not written down necessarily, but that's how things worked. The clerics were able to admonish and to restrain and to call back and so forth, as they did throughout the 19th century, for example, but they never claimed to have full power, right? They were, I think, smart enough to realize that that would be a real trap, because it's proven a trap in the Islamic Republic. And this idea that, these, which you hear Iranians say sometimes, who are these clerics, is just the new Arab invasion. Where did they come from? And my answer is all, as if they came all from Iraq and Bahrain this time too. My answer is, oh no, these people came from the Shahristan, from the depth of your own country. You just didn't know your own country, you elites, because you were shopping in Paris, so to speak, while the revolution was brewing, right? I mean, that's a bit of a, putting it somewhat harshly, but this idea also of Iran, as Kursh Kabir to Hala, this glorious civilization, and one country with one mission and so forth, Iran Javidan, I also reject, because I think it's ridiculous. Iran as a nation state is also a modern construct, just as all nation states are relatively new. Some are older than others, but there is no line from Julius Caesar to Berlusconi, right? And put it in an Italian perspective. And it's the same with Iran. There's an old civilization in Iran, and there are certain elements that one can trace through time. But the idea of a well-defined territory, Iranians, one ethnicity, one language, one culture, is all to be discarded right away. It's just bad history. So I fully agree with that. And I'm not sure, you had a second point, and I forgot.
Well, about this, selective reading of history, in the sense that if you're looking for certain,
that's of course a pitfall that maybe I'm not saying that I have not been able to avoid totally, because of course it's inherent. If you don't have sources or sufficient number of sources to solidify your argument, you end up treading ice, or thin ice, I should say. And I admittedly do that to some extent. I make some leaps. For the period from early Islam until the Mongol period and beyond, there's very little real information. So I'm maybe it was too daring for me to do that, but sometimes, good arguments start with arguments that have some holes in them, and then that's for other people to fill them in or discard them and refute them, right? So, that's my answer to that one. But yeah, I admit, of course, it's difficult.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Manu Chehitaki. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, please?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for giving me the floor. My question, first of all, thank you very much for the very broad argument and interesting ideas that you put forward. So I appreciate it. I'm not a historian, and I'm not a purely economist either. So allow me to be more generalist. I'm really responding in some of the points which I heard you mentioned, which are very broad. My questions are broad and philosophical. That there was resistance or xenophobia, if you could say, to imports, but also not having sufficient domestic internal production, partly because not having major industrialists, capitalists in Iran over the centuries, over the decade, let's say maybe one of the last centuries, to develop this space. So I'm trying to pick up that the fact that there were not major industrialists developed over the last few centuries was partly because of the dictatorship, that when the Shah was in power, any land owner, anyone becoming too rich and powerful, if he fell out of favor by the king, out of the favor of the Shah or the king Safavids onward, he would be killed or put aside, and all his owners, the lands and belongings would be given to the states and taken by the Shah. So there was, over the centuries, no development of a major aristocracy, industrial, capitalist group, and so on. And my other question is expanding this further, really following Professor Sari al-Ghalam's idea that the fact that there was Magna Carta in Europe and in England was that these landed gentry and powerful people tried to control the King John at the time in the 12th century, 1250. Now, in Iran, we never had enough people or groups to be able to control the king, and vice versa. So it was a vicious circle. Dictators did not allow the landed gentry, and there was no landed gentry to control the rulers and sort of lead to democracy. And at the end of all this, there was not much domestic industry in the face of the surge of new technology that in the last 2 or 3 centuries have been from Europe, and products rushing into these countries, including Iran. Anyway, this was a broad brush statement. So thank you, and share if you have any comments.
Again, I'll keep it brief because this is yet another grand topic. I fully agree with you. I mean, there is, of course, the long phenomenon, or the protected phenomenon, of the state confiscating land, riches. The Shah was always out to, or I should put it around, people of wealth and industry were always careful not to expose it, not to live ostentatiously behind high walls, not to display their opulence and so forth for fear of confiscation. And the Shah was in the business of doing so. In the Safavid period, there's a record that the Shah owned countless mansions that had been confiscated either by force or people died without offspring, and then the state would take over. And of course, this continues really until Reza Shah, right, in terms of landed property. So that is definitely an element. It is a tension between the aristocracy and the state. Capitalism, as we now know, is not simply a matter of laissez-faire, of just people just emerging and becoming industrious, but it's a collaboration between the state and an entrepreneurial class. And if that collaboration doesn't take place in a proper fashion, then capitalism languishes, and that's exactly what happened. I make that argument in this article in this book, because I do think it's a very important element. And yes, the other argument, sort of the other side of the same coin, is that the feudal system as it existed in Europe allowed to emerge a certain landed class that became a counterforce to the monarchy, and it ultimately clawed power back from the monarchy and ended up instituting a parliament with real teeth, with real power. And something similar didn't really happen in Iran really until the constitutional revolution, and then even then it was an uphill battle for the longest time because of the concentrated power of the court. So all that is true. I totally agree with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next question comes from Nader Habibi. So if you want to ask it verbally,
yes, thank you. So this is a diversion from your core argument, but I think it's something that really, I believe, needs to be addressed by economists or historians. You quoted Khomeini as saying, "Iqtisad mal khare," economy is for donkeys. A few years back, I was very curious about this, and I tried to find out why such a statement would be made even by someone like Khomeini. What I found, I don't remember the source now, but I believe what he was saying was that economy is like a donkey that you must ride to achieve your spiritual higher objectives, rather than saying economy is like a donkey. I was wondering if you or any of our colleagues have examined the authentic original source for this statement that is so famous.
I quite frankly, I struggled with that because it's a very famous bon mot, of course, but it's hard to find an authentic statement. And I didn't manage to do that. I have two sources, but they're both secondary sources, and they don't even give the original Persian as, Etisad Mawla Kharas. Because even if you find that, still it's open to interpretation. Did he elaborate on that, or was it just a factual statement left to interpretation? Because again, you could still, your interpretation is a possible one, but it's not the only possible one, of course. You could argue that he meant it's just for dumb people, or just, it's not important. Because this idea of you ride a donkey to a higher purpose, I'm not sure, unless he himself pointed in that direction, whether that would be the most logical and sensical interpretation of that phrase. But to come back to the point, I never found the actual source. I looked through his Hukumat Islami and various other writings, and I didn't find anything. And it's probably one of his statements, during the revolution, that are hidden somewhere in the, pages of Itila'at or something like that. But I haven't gone that deep to find. But it would be interesting, really, yes.
Thanks again. And we have a question by Nader Shamlu. So you're also invited to ask the question personally.
Yes, I don't know whether you can see me. The light is not. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation. And I have been reading your literature, your research before. And what had, of course, surprised me is that I had always been, as an Iranian, typical Iranian, I had been under the impression that Iran was vastly well off and rich throughout the history. And of course, everybody coveted Iran. And when I was reading your research, I came away with a different perspective, which I think you've elaborated during this session. My question is a little bit different, and I think in a way it kind of dovetails with what Manuchehr Takin was saying, the inability of Iran to have industrialists or capitalists that could generate, a different kind of economy or create a different kind of economy. And I was wondering what you think of Timur Kuran's view that actually what has held back, not he's talking more about the Muslim world, but what has held back the Muslim world is the inheritance laws in Islam, which fragment, because whoever dies, his assets or his estate gets fragmented among all of his heirs, and he even pinpoints that even women get inheritance, which I found to be a little bit kind of too much to swallow. But anyway, but whereas in the West there is this the concept of primogeniture, where the eldest child inherits everything, and as a result, assets and capital stays in one, in one contiguous, I would say, basis. And as a result, over time, it can accumulate, whereas in Islam, it gets, smaller and smaller. To what extent, what is your view about this, this statement or this view? And do you think that in Iran, was that the case also, for instance, how did Iran compare to the Ottoman Empire in the ability to maybe generate industrialists? I understand from his books that the industrialists in the Ottoman Empire were mostly minorities, Jews and Christians and so on. To what extent was that present in Iran? And essentially, this is my question. And thank you very much for all of this wonderful.
You're welcome. Fascinating and very important questions. I like Tim Quran's argument. I can't really comment on it, certainly not for Iran, because I'm not well versed at all in inheritance law, Iranian 19th century. I think we actually need a lot of research on that, because I've never seen anything substantive about that. But I think he's onto something. He's been severely criticized for all kinds of reasons, but I think I think he brings in an important argument. But then again, it's not either or. I think that is perhaps an important component, but it's not the only one. For me, a more important one is that if you look at the 19th century Iran again, you see a number of impulses. Well, first of all, there are no minorities, relatively speaking, in terms of numbers, right? It is true, Ottoman Empire, you like it or not, it's the Jews, the Armenians, the Greeks who bring in the first, industries, who set up the first, enterprises, in part because they're comfortable with the West, they know languages, they have a leg up, right? And Muslims, for them, avenue towards wealth is the military and the bureaucracy. So business is good for minorities. That's basically the setup. In Iran, you have minorities, but they're far smaller in number, right? And they don't necessarily operate in these coastal cities and Bushehr and so forth. Some, but there's simply no critical mass. There's also so they never form real enclaves, anywhere. Really, a little bit in Tehran later on, Armenians, but of course, they all got wiped out also during World War I, with the Turks invading and so forth. So that's an important element right there. But I think the most important element in the relatively lack of industrialization, 19th century, is really that any kind of initiative is still born because it remains personal and private and individual. The initiative of a Amir Kabir, or a Mushir Dole, or Abbas Mirza to begin with, right? Who then dies prematurely, and he doesn't have the full backing of the father, right? Because Fath Ali Shah is busy with other things, as we all know. So this collaboration never gets off the ground, and it's all episodic and fragmentary, and it stalls, and then we're waiting for a next person with vision, but again, he doesn't have the full backing of the Shah. I look at Nasruddin Shah. Goes to Europe 3 times, spends an enormous amounts of money, picks up a lot of things, but it's mostly sort of the gadgets, the shiny objects. You know what I mean? He goes to Vienna, he goes to London and Paris. He's dazzled, and he wants all this stuff too. But it's a little bit like a kid in a candy shop. You know what I mean? There's no blueprint behind it that he brings back. He doesn't take a bevy of advisors with him, people who are karshinas. So it all remains somewhat superficial and not sustained by government initiative. I think that's the most important. There's this enormous amount of talent always been there in Iran. Entrepreneurs, you name them, but they were all beholden to the court. And far into the 20th century, they gave away these positions to the highest bidders. Auctioning off the zarb, the sikke, what you call it, the mint. I mean, how do you build a nation like that in a modern sense of the word? You know what I mean? It just breeds corruption and nothing else. And I think that is, and again, not to discount other arguments at all, because I think it's always a combination of different things. But if you want a priority, that would be my highest priority.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we have 2 raised hands. One is from the audience, and I think Soran Mohtadi, there's no possibility to speak maybe. But Manu Chehtakin also has his hand raised. So do you have a remark or comment?
Yes, please, if I may, it probably expanding a bit rather than directly related to your talk, as we continue coming to the 20th century, more recent history, and the Muslim world, and the lack or the development of private sector and industrialization and so on. I've been looking the last few days, few weeks, and reading about Saudi Arabia. That is the country which supposedly we thought had private sector and so on, other than the merchants. And then all these were taken and put into this grand prison, Ritz Hotel. The monies were taken away. Now we have them back, but it is the crown prince or the king by decree. and they are doing great things. What investment diversification, what they are now doing is really tremendous. So there is command economy by degree, rather than the private sector competition and capitalism developing. Now, this is opposite to what we always criticize, that it should be free market and so on. Anyway, this is maybe, as I said, not related to going outside the scope of your talk, but talking about Islam, Islamic world, and capitalists, and so on, technology, and so on. I thought to raise this point that Saudi Arabia is the dilemma. It is the other way around. If not for the money from the oil sector, they probably wouldn't have been successful. But it seems that they are successful at present.
Well,
on the paper.
At that point, I'm not sure if I beg to differ, but I think the jury is still out. I think it's too early to tell whether that Vision 2030 and beyond is going to succeed. I think it's premature to really judge that. At least I don't want to speak out on that. So,
Thank you.
Sure.
So I think we do not have a question by Suran Muhtadi because I do not see any raised hands. Okay.
Yes. I guess the questions we have already covered all the questions. That was a great round of question and answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to all participants for the excellent questions, and also to Rudi for your thought-provoking presentation and erudite answers. So thank you to all of you.
Yeah, also thanks, Rudi, for this beautiful presentation, also on the behalf of IIEA. Also thanks all the participants for joining this discussion and the question and answer. And yes, I wanted to also say that from the side of IIEA that we are returning back to these monthly webinars after the summer break, hopefully at some point in September or October. So we will announce it on the website and in social media. And yes, that was, as I said, it was quite an interesting topic on the history of self-sufficiency on Iran. I personally learned a lot. Thank you very much, Rudi, for this very informative presentation. Also, Bianca, for this moderation and excellent management of this session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for the spirited discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.